At 27,300 feet above Bremen, Germany, Second Lieutenant Charles Brown felt the B-17 shudder as the first flak shell detonated 20 yards ahead of his aircraft. The date was December 20th, 1943. The temperature outside was 60 degrees below 0 Celsius. Inside the cockpit of the B-17F Flying Fortress, named Ye Olde Pub, Brown could see his breath crystallizing in the air despite his oxygen mask and heated flight suit. This was Brown's first mission as aircraft commander. He was 21 years old. Behind him sat 9 other men whose lives depended entirely on his decisions in the next 60 minutes. They had been airborne for 3 hours. The target was a Focke-Wulf 190 factory in the heart of Bremen, one of the most heavily defended cities in Nazi Germany. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Brown watched the formation ahead begin dropping their bombs. Smoke and fire erupted from the factory complex below. The bomb run would last 10 minutes. 10 minutes of flying straight and level while German flak batteries fired everything they had at the bomber stream stretching 8 miles across the winter sky. No evasive maneuvers, no variation in altitude or heading. The bombardier needed stable flight to aim properly. Those 10 minutes felt like 10 hours. The flak intensified. Black puffs of smoke appeared all around the formation. Each puff represented an 88mm shell that had exploded, sending thousands of steel fragments through the air at supersonic speed. The shells were fused to detonate at specific altitudes. German radar tracked the bomber stream continuously, calculating altitude and adjusting fuse settings to maximize casualties. Brown's bombardier, Second Lieutenant Robert Andrews, called out over the intercom, 30 seconds to target. The bomb bay doors opened beneath the aircraft. The opening created additional drag, slowing the bomber slightly. Brown compensated by adding throttle to engines 3 and 4. Engine number 2 had been running rough since takeoff. Engine number 4 required constant attention to prevent overspeeding. A red flash exploded directly in front of Ye Olde Pub's nose. The plexiglass nose cone shattered instantly. Fragments tore through the bombardier's compartment. Andrews ducked instinctively as freezing winds screamed through the opening at over 200 miles per hour. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Albert Sadok, pressed himself against the floor as more shells detonated nearby. Engine number 2 took a direct hit. The right cyclone radial engine, all 1,800 horsepower of it, disintegrated in a shower of metal and flame. Oil sprayed across the wing. Flames licked back from the destroyed engine cowling. Brown immediately hit the engine fire extinguisher, flooding the nacelle with carbon dioxide. The flames died, but the engine was gone. Dead weight hanging from the left wing. Another shell exploded above and to the right. Shrapnel tore through the right wing between engines 3 and 4. More fragments punctured the fuselage in a dozen places. Engine number 4 began overspeeding, the propeller spinning faster than designed limits. Brown pulled the throttle back to idle, but the engine continued running wild. The propeller governor had been damaged. If the engine tore itself apart, the entire right wing could be lost. Brown fought the controls, with engine 2 completely dead and engine 4 throttled back to near idle to prevent catastrophic failure. The aircraft was producing perhaps half its rated power from the 2 remaining engines. The B-17 began falling behind the formation. The other bombers maintained altitude and speed. Ye Olde Pub could do neither. Andrews called over the intercom, "Bombs away." 12 500-pound bombs fell from the bay. The aircraft jumped upward slightly as nearly 3 tons of weight dropped away. Brown felt momentary relief. The primary mission was complete. The bombs would hit the factory. Now, they just had to get home. The relief lasted exactly 4 seconds. The formation ahead was pulling away. Brown pushed the throttles forward on engines 1 and 3, the only 2 functioning properly. The engines responded, but it wasn't enough. The damaged aircraft couldn't match the formation's speed. Within 2 minutes, Ye Olde Pub had fallen 500 yards behind. Within 5 minutes, the gap had opened to half a mile. Brown understood what this meant. Bomber formations stayed together for mutual protection. Each B-17 carried 13 50-caliber machine guns. A formation of 200 bombers created an overlapping field of defensive fire that German fighters couldn't easily penetrate. Fighters attacked stragglers first. Stragglers died first. Ye Olde Pub was now a straggler. Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, the co-pilot, pointed through the right window. Brown looked. His stomach dropped. A formation of German fighters was assembling 3,000 feet below, dark silhouettes against the snow-covered landscape. Messerschmitt, Bf 109s, and Focke-Wulf 190s. The Luftwaffe's best interceptors. They had spotted the crippled bomber. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, reported over the intercom. "Bandit, 6 o'clock low, 12 fighters, maybe 15. They're forming up for an attack run." Brown acknowledged. He turned to Luke. "When they come, turn into them. Make them work for it." Luke nodded. His hands were already on the controls, ready to assist. The German fighters attacked in waves. The first wave came from behind and below, the classic approach that gave attacking fighters maximum speed advantage. Eckenrode opened fire with his twin 50 calibers. Tracers arced toward the approaching fighters. The top turret gunner, Sergeant Bertrand Coulomb, rotated his turret aft and added his fire to Eckenrode's. The Focke-Wulf 190s closed to 400 yards. Their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns opened fire. Shells and bullets converged on Ye Olde Pub. The sound was terrifying, like someone throwing gravel against a tin roof, but louder, more violent. Cannon shells exploded on impact. Machine gun bullets punched through aluminum skin as if it were paper. Brown turned hard left, directly into the attacking fighters. The maneuver forced them to adjust their aim. Most of their fire missed. Most, but not all. A 20mm shell exploded in the radio compartment. The radio operator, Sergeant Richard Petchute, screamed as fragments struck his face. His right eye was gone. Blood streamed down his flight suit. Another shell tore through the left wing, the explosion visible from the cockpit. More holes appeared in the fuselage. The hydraulic system pressure began dropping. Brown watched the gauge fall. Without hydraulics, they would lose brakes, landing gear operation, and some control surface assist. The aircraft would become much harder to fly. The first wave of fighters flashed past, overshooting because of Brown's defensive turn. The second wave was already lining up. These came from the right side, from 3 o'clock high. The waist gunners, Sergeants Lloyd Jennings and Alex Yelasanko, opened fire through their side windows. Spent shell casings clattered onto the floor, accumulating around their boots. More cannon fire raked the bomber. Engine number 3 took multiple hits. The engine didn't explode, but power output dropped by half. Brown could feel it through the throttle. The engine was still running, but producing perhaps 400 horsepower instead of 800. Ye Olde Pub was now operating on approximately 40% of its total rated power. 4 engines should produce 7,200 horsepower combined. They had maybe 3,000 available. The third wave came from ahead, a frontal attack that gave the fighters only seconds of firing time, but also gave the bombers' guns minimal opportunity to engage. The German fighters dove from above, lined up perfectly with Ye Olde Pub's nose, and opened fire at point-blank range. Andrews, still in the bombardier position despite the shattered nose, fired the single forward-facing gun that still functioned. 2 of the nose guns had jammed. Their mechanisms had frozen in the 60 below zero temperature because the ground crew had failed to oil them properly. A 30mm cannon shell from a Focke-Wulf 190 struck the number 3 engine's cowling. The heavy shell penetrated, but didn't explode. If it had detonated inside the engine, the wing would have been blown off. Instead, it lodged in the engine block, causing massive vibration. Oil began leaking. Engine temperature started rising. Brown made a decision. He couldn't sustain this. The fighters were overwhelming them. The guns were jamming. The crew was being wounded. The aircraft was being destroyed piece by piece. He had maybe 30 seconds before the next wave attacked. He pushed the control column forward hard. Ye Olde Pub's nose dropped sharply. The bomber entered a steep dive, rolling inverted as it descended. Brown intended to escape into the clouds below, but the maneuver went wrong. The oxygen system had been damaged in the attacks. The lines feeding Brown's mask were compromised. He was getting insufficient oxygen at 25,000 feet. Hypoxia set in within seconds. His vision tunneled. His fingers felt numb on the controls. He could see the ground rotating above him because the aircraft was inverted. He tried to roll upright, but his reactions were slowed. He was losing consciousness. The B-17 continued its inverted dive, accelerating toward terminal velocity. Luke saw what was happening. He grabbed the controls and pulled back, trying to level the aircraft, but Brown's hands were still on his control column, unconsciously pushing forward. Luke was fighting both the aerodynamic forces and Brown's hypoxic inputs. The bomber continued descending, rotating slowly, completely out of control. At 8,000 feet, Brown regained partial consciousness. His oxygen mask was delivering air again. The pressure had equalized enough that the system functioned marginally. He saw the ground above him, realized the aircraft was inverted, and pulled with everything he had. The bomber shuddered. The airframe groaned under the stress. The wings flexed. Metal screamed. Ye Olde Pub rolled upright at less than 1,000 feet above the ground. Trees and fields filled the windscreen. Brown pulled back further. The nose, slowly, painfully slowly, began to rise. The aircraft leveled off at approximately 300 feet, barely clearing a line of trees at the edge of a forest. They were alive. The German fighters had broken off, assuming the bomber was finished. No aircraft could survive that kind of dive and recovery. Ye Olde Pub should have broken apart from the aerodynamic stress. The wings should have torn off. The tail should have separated. But Boeing had built these aircraft well. The structure held. Brown took stock of their situation. They were flying at 300 feet above German-occupied territory. Engine 2 was completely destroyed. Engine 4 was damaged and could only run at idle power. Engine 3 was operating at half power, vibrating badly, leaking oil and overheating. Engine 1 was functioning normally, but one good engine wasn't enough to maintain altitude and speed. The electrical system was damaged. Interior lights flickered. The intercom worked intermittently. The hydraulic system was failing. The landing gear might not extend properly when they reached England. The oxygen system was compromised. The nose cone was gone. The tail section was shredded. The rudder was half destroyed. The port elevator was mostly missing. Half the control surfaces were damaged or inoperative. Brown called over the intercom for status reports from each crew position. The responses came back one by one. The tail gunner, Eckenrode, didn't respond. Coulomb reported that Eckenrode's position had taken a direct hit. The tail gunner was dead, his body still in the turret but decapitated by a cannon shell. Pashut reported his injury. His right eye was destroyed. He was partially blind and losing blood. Yelisenko had been hit in the leg by shrapnel. The wound was serious. He couldn't stand. Jennings was helping apply pressure to stop the bleeding. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Samuel Blackford, reported his feet were frozen. The heating elements in his flight suit had shorted out. He had frostbite developing in both feet. 8 men were alive. 1 was dead. 3 were seriously wounded. 2 more had minor injuries or frostbite. They were 300 feet above Nazi Germany with 1 functioning engine, minimal control authority, and no way to defend themselves if more fighters arrived. England was 250 miles northwest, across enemy territory and the North Sea. Brown looked at the fuel gauges. The tanks had been punctured in multiple places. Fuel was leaking, but slowly enough that they might have enough to reach England if the engines didn't quit first. The oil pressure on engine 3 was dropping steadily. If that engine seized, they would be down to 1 engine. A B-17 could theoretically fly on 2 engines. Flying on 1 was aerodynamically possible, but practically impossible for any extended period. Luke pointed ahead through the shattered windscreen. A German airfield was visible 2 miles distant. Fighters were parked in revetments along the runway. Brown could see ground crew working on several aircraft. If they flew directly over that airfield, someone would certainly report it. More fighters would scramble. Ye Olde Pub wouldn't survive another attack. Brown banked left, steering away from the airfield, staying low over the forest. The damaged bomber cleared the trees by less than 50 feet. Navigation at this altitude was difficult. Brown couldn't see more than a few miles ahead. He had no landmarks to guide by. The compass was functioning, but compass headings meant little when you couldn't see where you were going. What Brown didn't know was that his decision to avoid the airfield had sealed their fate in an entirely unexpected way. On that airfield, a Luftwaffe pilot named Oberleutnant Franz Stigler had just landed after his 2nd bomber kill of the day. Stigler was a veteran fighter ace with 27 confirmed victories. One more bomber destroyed would earn him the Knight's Cross, one of Germany's highest military honors. Stigler was standing beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109, discussing the morning's combat with his ground crew, when Ye Olde Pub flew directly overhead. At 300 feet, the damaged bomber was impossible to miss. The missing nose cone, the destroyed engine, the torn fuselage, the blood-streaked sides where wounded gunners had been. Stigler made an instant decision. This was his chance for the Knight's Cross. He ran to his aircraft, which had just been refueled and rearmed. The ground crew scrambled to help him back into the cockpit. Within 90 seconds, Stigler's Bf 109 was rolling down the runway. Within 3 minutes, he was airborne and climbing to intercept the crippled American bomber. Brown didn't see the German fighter take off behind him. He was focused entirely on keeping Ye Olde Pub flying. The controls felt wrong. The rudder barely responded. The elevators were mushy and imprecise. Every control input required twice the normal force. The aircraft wanted to roll left because of the asymmetric thrust from the dead and damaged engines. Brown held right aileron constantly just to maintain wings level. Engine 3's oil pressure continued dropping. The temperature gauge climbed into the red zone. Brown knew the engine would seize soon. When it did, they would be down to engine 1. He began calculating in his head. Airspeed at current power was 110 miles per hour. Distance to England was 250 miles. Flight time would be over 2 hours if they maintained this speed and heading. 2 hours flying across enemy territory on failing engines with wounded crew and minimal defensive capability. The mathematics was simple. They were not going to make it. Stigler's Messerschmitt caught up to the B-17 within minutes. He approached from behind and below, the standard attack position that maximized his firing advantage. His finger rested on the trigger. The gun sight reticle centered on the bomber's fuselage. One squeeze of the trigger would send 20mm cannon shells and 13mm machine gun rounds into the already crippled aircraft. It would be over in seconds. But Stigler didn't fire. Instead, he pulled alongside the bomber, positioning his fighter just 3 feet from the B-17's right wingtip. What he saw, through the massive holes torn in the fuselage, stopped him completely. Through the torn metal skin, Stigler could see directly into the bomber's interior. He saw wounded men slumped against bulkheads. He saw blood on the floor. He saw crew members frantically trying to apply bandages to their injured companions. He saw the tail gunner's position, empty except for what remained of the man who had occupied it. The entire tail section was shredded, the metal peeled back like paper. Brown saw the German fighter appear alongside his right wing. His heart stopped. This was it. They were defenseless. Most of the guns had jammed. The few gunners who weren't wounded or dead were focused on keeping the aircraft flying and helping the injured. Brown waited for the cannon fire that would end everything. It didn't come. Instead, the German pilot looked directly at him. Their eyes met across 36 inches of empty air. Stigler was close enough that Brown could see his face clearly through the canopy. The German pilot nodded, just a simple nod of acknowledgement. Then he gestured toward the ground, pointing downward repeatedly. Brown didn't understand. Was the German ordering him to land, telling him to crash, warning him of something ahead? Stigler kept pointing down and making hand signals that Brown couldn't interpret. The language barrier was absolute. They could see each other but couldn't communicate. Stigler tried a different approach. He flew ahead of the B-17, then banked hard left toward the north. He was pointing the way to Sweden. Neutral Sweden was closer than England. If the bomber diverted north and made it to Swedish airspace, the crew would survive. They would spend the rest of the war interned, but they would live. Their families would be notified they were alive. It was the best possible outcome given the circumstances, but Brown didn't understand Stigler's intentions. He thought the German was trying to force him off course, to separate him further from any possible help. Brown shook his head and maintained his heading northwest toward England. Stigler flew back alongside, frustrated but impressed by the American pilot's determination. What happened next violated every regulation in the Luftwaffe. Stigler made a decision that could have resulted in his execution if discovered. He decided to escort the crippled bomber out of German airspace. He would protect it from other German fighters. He would prevent anti-aircraft batteries from firing on it. He would give these wounded men a chance to reach home. Stigler's decision was rooted in something his commanding officer, Gustav Rödel, had told him years earlier during combat operations in North Africa. Rödel had gathered his pilots and stated clearly that if he ever saw or heard of any of them shooting at a man in a parachute, he would shoot that pilot himself. The principle was simple. You don't kill defenseless enemies. Chivalry still existed, even in total war. Looking at the shattered B-17, Stigler saw men in parachutes. They were still in their aircraft, but they were just as defenseless. The bomber had no chance of fighting back. The gunners were dead, wounded, or focused entirely on survival. Shooting them down would be murder, not combat. Stigler couldn't do it. He flew alongside Ye Olde Pub for the next 30 minutes, matching the bomber's slow speed and low altitude. When they approached German anti-aircraft positions, Stigler flew close enough that German gunners could see his Messerschmitt clearly. The gunners held their fire, confused but following protocol. If a Luftwaffe fighter was escorting an aircraft, that aircraft must be friendly, regardless of its markings. Brown watched the German fighter with complete confusion and growing hope. The pilot wasn't attacking. He was protecting them. Brown didn't know why, couldn't understand the motivation, but he recognized the gesture for what it was. This enemy pilot was giving them a chance. They crossed the German coast near Wilhelmshaven. The North Sea stretched ahead, grey and cold and hostile. Stigler flew alongside until they were well over international waters. Then he did something Brown would remember for the rest of his life. Stigler looked directly at Brown one final time. He saluted. A clean, crisp military salute from one pilot to another. Then he banked hard right and disappeared back toward Germany. Brown sat in stunned silence. Luke stared at him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. What had just happened defied explanation. A German fighter ace had escorted them to safety instead of shooting them down. It made no tactical sense. It violated all combat doctrine. Yet, it had happened. The flight across the North Sea took 1 hour and 40 minutes. Engine 3 seized 12 minutes after Stigler departed. The oil had run out completely. The engine locked solid. The propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. Ye Olde Pub was now flying on Engine 1 alone, supplemented slightly by the damaged Engine 4, running at minimal power. Brown held the controls with both hands, fighting constantly to keep the wings level. The aircraft wanted to roll left toward the dead engines. His arms ached. His shoulders burned. Luke helped when he could, but the control forces were too great for one man to handle alone for extended periods. They traded off every 10 minutes, giving each other brief rest. Coulomb came forward from the top turret. He had crawled back to check on the wounded. Yelisanko was still alive, but had lost significant blood. Pichut was conscious, despite his destroyed eye. Blackford's feet were completely numb from frostbite. Eckenrode was still in the tail turret, beyond help. Coulomb reported all this matter-of-factly, his voice flat over the damaged intercom. The English coast appeared ahead after 98 minutes over the North Sea. Brown had never seen anything more beautiful. The white cliffs were barely visible through the haze, but they were there. England, home, safety. If they could just make it to an airfield. Brown tried to raise the nearest RAF station on the radio. But the radio was dead. The electrical system damage had finally killed it completely. He would have to find an airfield visually and hope they saw him coming. Landing without radio contact was dangerous but manageable. Landing with one engine and damaged controls was nearly impossible. RAF seething appeared through the mist. The airfield was a bomber base, home to B-24 Liberators of the 4th Bombardment Group. The runways were long enough for heavy bombers. Brown lined up for final approach. He tried to extend the landing gear. The hydraulic system had failed completely. The gear wouldn't come down. Luke reached for the emergency extension handle. The B-17 had a manual backup system that used cables and gravity to lower the landing gear when hydraulics failed. Luke pulled the handle. They felt the gear begin to extend, the wheels slowly dropping into position. The main gear locked down. The nose gear extended, but the indicator light showed it hadn't locked properly. Brown had no choice. He committed to the landing. Airspeed dropped to 90 miles per hour. The runway threshold approached. Brown pulled engine 1 to idle and raised the nose slightly. The main wheels touched down hard. The nose gear slammed onto concrete. The unlocked nose gear collapsed immediately. Ye Olde Pub's nose hit the runway in a shower of sparks. The aircraft slid forward on its belly, the metal screeching against concrete. Brown killed all the switches, shutting down the remaining engines and the electrical system. The bomber slid for 800 feet before grinding to a stop 50 yards from the runway edge. Emergency crews were already racing toward them. Fire trucks and ambulances surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Medics climbed through the torn fuselage to reach the wounded. Stretchers appeared. Pechot was carried out first, still conscious. Yelesanko came next, unconscious from blood loss. Blackford walked out supported by 2 medics, his frozen feet unable to bear weight properly. Brown and Luke climbed out through the cockpit side windows. Their legs buckled when they tried to stand. They had been sitting under tension for over 5 hours. Their muscles had locked up. Medics helped them away from the aircraft. Brown looked back at Ye Olde Pub. The bomber was destroyed. Over 200 bullet and shell holes. 3 engines dead or damaged beyond repair. The nose gone. The tail shredded. Half the control surfaces missing. Ground crew inspectors examined the wreckage. One crew chief counted the hits and stopped at 200. Another inspector found cannon shell fragments in the fuselage and held them up, marveling that they hadn't exploded. A third inspector looked at the tail section and couldn't understand how the aircraft had maintained any control authority at all with so much damage. Brown reported to the base commanding officer. He explained the mission, the damage, the fight, and the escape. Then he told them about the German fighter pilot who had escorted them to safety instead of shooting them down. The officers listened in silence. When Brown finished, the senior officer told him he had done well and should get some rest. The story about the German pilot was not to be repeated. High Command would not appreciate stories of enemy compassion. The war required men to hate the enemy, not acknowledge their humanity. Brown never spoke publicly about Franz Stigler for 43 years. The incident was classified, not because it contained military secrets, but because it contradicted the narrative that total war required. The story disappeared into classified files and fading memories. Ye Olde Pub never flew combat again. The aircraft was returned to the United States in April 1944. It was scrapped in August 1945, reduced to scrap metal and recycled aluminum. The bomber that had survived the impossible was dismantled by cutting torches in a salvage yard, forgotten except by the 9 men whose lives it had saved. Brown completed his combat tour. He flew more missions, earned his decorations, and survived the war. He returned to West Virginia in 1945, attended college, and eventually rejoined the Air Force in 1949. He served until 1965, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He never forgot the German pilot who had saved his life and the lives of his crew. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. 43 years after that December day over Germany, Brown finally decided to search for the mysterious German pilot. He didn't know the pilot's name. He didn't know if the man had survived the war. He didn't even know if the man was still alive. But Brown remembered the salute. He remembered the gesture of mercy. He needed to find this man and say thank you. Brown wrote letters to veteran organizations in Germany. He contacted the Luftwaffe Historical Office. He searched through captured German records. Nothing. No one knew of a fighter pilot who had escorted a damaged American bomber to safety. The story seemed too incredible to believe. In 1990, Brown wrote one final letter to a newsletter for German fighter pilots called Jägerblatt. He described the incident in detail: the date, the location, the aircraft markings, the salute. He asked if anyone knew who this pilot might have been. Franz Stigler was living in Vancouver, Canada, when he read that letter. He had survived the war, flying Messerschmitt Me Tu-62 jets in the final months. He had immigrated to Canada in 1953 and built a successful business. He had never told anyone about the bomber he had escorted to safety in December 1943. The risk had been too great during the war. After the war, it seemed irrelevant. But when Stigler read Brown's letter, tears filled his eyes. He picked up the phone and called the number Brown had listed. Brown answered. Stigler said simply, "I was the one." They talked for hours that first call. Stigler described his aircraft, the escort, the salute. He provided details that only the German pilot could have known. Brown knew immediately this was the man who had saved his life. They met in person on June 21st, 1990. When they saw each other, both men cried. They embraced, like brothers separated for 46 years. From 1990 until 2008, Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler were inseparable. They traveled together, speaking at schools and veteran events. They told their story to anyone who would listen. They proved that even in the worst war in human history, humanity could survive. Honor could exist. Mercy was possible. Both men died in 2008. Just 8 months apart. Stigler died in March. Brown died in November. They were buried thousands of miles apart, but their friendship had transcended the war that should have made them eternal enemies. Their story proved that some things matter more than orders, more than medals, more than victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.